So 7 brothers marry the same woman, and each one of them dies in his prime. If I were brother number 3 or later, I'd have thought about that twice before marrying that woman. Today, Jesus talks about what happens after we die, and the Sadducees think they're laying a trap for him when they ask him about the woman who'd been married those 7 times to each of the brothers, and whose wife she would be in the afterlife. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Sadducees today, but you need to know that they were a kind of priestly class and were one of the leading parties of the Jewish people in Jesus's time. They were a small group, yet they were quite influential, and they were part of the temple apparatus as well as the priests there. But they were also wealthy citizens within Jerusalem, which was where the temple and all its worship was. So they were quite important in their day. The problem with them was that some of their beliefs ran counter to what most of the Jews, including the Pharisees, believed. And one of those beliefs had to do with the afterlife. Where most of the Jewish people believed in life after death, the Sadducees did not at all. Their belief and teaching was that this life is it. And once you die, well, there's nothing else, nothing. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us today, unless you know the ancient Jewish law, but the Sadducees set up their little scenario, which they presented to Jesus, because they were hoping to push Jesus into a corner to show just how ridiculous the idea of the resurrection is. And they were going to make a point that they, and not Jesus, more completely understood the ways of God. Well, most of the Jews of that time believed in the immortality of the soul. And that's the idea that in some ways, our souls survive death and continue to exist, even though they're separated from the body. The Jews also believed in resurrection, and that would be the reunion of the body and soul after death in a new creation, in a new heaven and a new earth that God will somehow bring about. And the bottom line for the Sadducees was that they were so sure of their position that they thought they could make a fool of Jesus. Imagine that. They thought that he was leading the people astray, but he was also cutting into their action as authorities. And so they asked the question that they asked. But in responding to them, Jesus tells us some very interesting things about what happens after we die. And I thought I'd take you through some of it. First of all, Jesus confirms that our souls continue to exist despite the death of our bodies. And he goes on to say that the world of this earthly life is not the same as the life that we may attain after death and ultimate resurrection. In the current life of this world, we marry. But in the next life, that's not going to be there, because in the next life, death will not be a factor or a reality. And he tells us why. One of the reasons for marriage is to provide for children and the transmission of life in order to keep the human race going, so that it would not die out as a result of sin and death. People having children transmits life to new generations. But after the resurrection, with no more death, there's no longer the need for marriage as we know it. Incidentally, that's why marriage vows in the church are taken only until one of the spouses dies. It ensures that the survivor can continue to participate in transmitting new life. Now, I used to talk to my father about this point. He was worried, in fact, very worried, about what his relationship with my mom would be in the next life. She died over 20 years ago, and he figured that because they were once married, they would be married always and forever. And so the thought of remarrying remained far from his heart and from his mind. I think he assumed and wanted their marital relationship to extend into the next life. And while Jesus tells us that marriage as we know it in this life won't exist in the resurrected life, that does not mean that special and very special relationships won't continue in heaven. The problem with the Sadducees' question of Jesus is that it assumes that if there were to be a resurrection, the circumstances of this world would extend into the next world. And Jesus corrects that very, very wrong assumption. And again, the basic difference is that after the resurrection, people will not die again, and a life without death is very, very different to this life, which is always hugely influenced by the reality of death. St. Paul, in one of his letters, said that once Jesus had been raised from the dead, death no longer has any power over him. And in heaven, we will share in the Lord's own risen life. And that will be a very, very different life from the one that we are now living. And because the life we enter after death will be forever, the way we will relate to each other will be quite different from how we relate to each other today in this world. Now, he purposely doesn't say much about it other than to simply say that the next life will be very, very different. Now, in the next life, our union with God will be perfected, but our union with one another will also be perfected, and our lives will be a perfect communion with all the saints in Jesus Christ himself. That's a very difficult thing for us to imagine in this fallen world, but Jesus came in part to tell us to have faith in him, and it was his passion, death, and resurrection that ultimately points to the realities of what we have to look forward to if we remain faithful to him. His earthly ministry was about bringing people around himself, forming a new kind of community never before seen in the history of the world. He understood and built this community, soon to be called his church, to be a sign of the life to come, and it would point ahead to God's kingdom. And here he suggests that the life of heaven is so completely new that no experience in this current life can compare with it. St. Paul, in one of his letters, says that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has the human heart imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. And Jesus says that even though Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph died around 1,900 years before Jesus' time, God remains their God. God remains alive to them, and they are alive to God, even though we can't see it. Their bond of love and faith with God has not been broken through death. And his point is that God's love and faithfulness to us extends beyond our lives on this earth, and he continues to hold us in that loving embrace even after we die. Jesus himself used the image of a great banquet where all that we were made for is finally fulfilled and we become fully alive. Now, I know that many of us fear that we have lost loved ones. We have to continue to believe that they are not lost. For each of us to believe in our own personal resurrections is a wonderful gift in this life, and it gives meaning and perspective to all that make up our lives. Today, I ask you to exercise that gift by praying for all the souls that you know that have gone before you. November is the month for that, and by praying for others, perhaps God will provide extra grace for you in working toward your goal of eternal life with God and with all of our loved ones who have gone before us and with all who will be invited to that heavenly banquet someday.